Let's talk about Leif. What's up with Leif and his inherited skills? So Leif is one of the earlier emblems you get. You do lose him early on, and then you regain him back as you enter, pretty much as you enter the mid game, or the late mid game, so almost as you enter the end game. And what he allows you to do, generally, is get Vantage to increase build, or increase and decrease hit rates on yourself on a knife, with hit avoid +5 and so on, with knife precision. So let's go over his abilities. So let's start with build. So the build plus line is very straightforward. It increases build. What does build do? Build offsets weapon weight. So if you have a heavy weapon, the heavier the weapon, the more it reduces your speed based on your build stat. So if you have a build of 10 and you're wielding a weapon with 14 weight, you will experience -4 speed. So if you got build +4, you would now be 14 build. On a 14 weight weapon, you would not lose speed. So that's all build does. So it's essentially a different type of speed skill that interacts specifically with weapon weight. So if you are using weapons that you can effectively wield without losing speed due to build and weight, then you don't need this at all. However, this can be useful because you can get it early, but you can't get it that much earlier than speed. You can start getting speed from chapter 12 and onward from Lin, and the cost is the same. And the advantage of speed versus build is if you have light weapons your unit uses, they now just have more speed on those light weapons to potentially double more enemies. Whereas if you have excess build on a light weapon, it's not going to improve your speed. So the build line is not bad, and there are use cases where it's fine to go for, but it really depends on the unit, and most units are better off getting speed. And there are very rare circumstances in which it makes sense to get build. One thing to note, however, though, is build +5 requires bond level 14. So if you know for a fact you're going to be using a heavy weapon, you can run this, because if you look at Lin, speed +5 is bond level 19. And bond level 19 is going to cost you thousands of extra fragments, whereas bond level 14 is significantly fewer. Maybe it's like an extra 2,000-3,000 fragments, but it's much cheaper in terms of bond fragments to get build +5. So if you know you're going to be using like a Brave Lance on like Chimera, for example, and she's never going to have enough build, you can just get her build +5. It does the same thing. Alright, so that's build. It can also be useful for offsetting weight for heavy tomes on certain magic units like Anna and maybe Saline. Same thing for 11 sword builds. But aside from that, that's really all it's really used for. Arm Shield. This one is interesting in that it reduces damage taken when you have weapon advantage. So it's kind of like a tanky ability, but it can be inconsistent. And honestly, I don't recommend it at all because there are a lot of enemy weapon types that you're never going to have advantage over. So for example, tomes, daggers, and for the most part, things like swords. Like you can have advantage over swords. You're going to need to be on lances. But you can usually just tank the sword, so it doesn't really matter. For the things you want it on, you generally want it on incoming tome damage, depending on the class. Maybe if it's like a critical weakness, something like that. Maybe axes. So if you're on swords, you're probably already high avoid, and you're probably not getting hit anyways. Or maybe if you are, 5 less damage. If you're going to be taking like 30 damage, taking 25 versus 30 damage doesn't really matter that much. So in the cases in which it'd be useful, don't seem to matter that much. And they're definitely better passives. I don't think it's worth getting at all. If you disagree, I'd like to hear why, but I think they're just better things. It is cheap though. I will say this. It is very cheap. So if you can take advantage of this and you can consistently trigger this to reduce damage and you're already on a tanky unit, it could be a good option. So I'm not going to completely dismiss it. It is cheap, and the damage mitigation is nice, but it's very situational, and you'd have to pay a lot of attention as to what your foes are wielding. So there's definitely some situational awareness required in planning. All right, so Vantage. This is definitely a good one. Vantage allows you to hit them before they hit you if your health is at a certain threshold. So, Vantage, base Vantage. If you're at 25% HP or less and the foe attacks you, you counterattack before their first attack. Now, this isn't really super good. Where it starts to get good is Vantage Plus. 50, like below 50%, like at 50% or less, is a much easier threshold to hit. 25% I find is harder to fix, but you can fix it with holdout, so you can make sure you're below the threshold and you don't die. But being at 50% or less is pretty easy to meet. And what you can do is you can run like a Wrath Vantage build where you crit things and counterattack. Now, only certain units can really pull this off consistently, so this isn't something that everyone can just generically run and it always works. If you want to run it on everyone, you're going to be running into like 70 to 80% crit rates, and there's going to be some chance for failure where you can miss a crit and then just get bodied. So you have to be aware of that. Vantage Plus Plus works at 75%, so generally Vantage Plus is enough, and if you're running a crit Wrath build, you are going to be, at like 50% or lower. So maybe sitting at like 30 to 40%. So that way you have some cushion so that if something kills you, holdout triggers and then you survive. So you'd run like Vantage and holdout with Ike, or you would run Roy and then Vantage and Wrath. Or you could run Leif and then run, of those, holdout's 2k SP, Wrath is 2k SP. So generally you're not, you're going to want to unlock Vantage Plus because it's cheaper in terms of SP. So usually you don't run Leif and then unlock the other ones, but you could because of the well, so that wouldn't be too bad. But it's used in specific builds like that. It's definitely an enemy phase ability. It only functions on enemy phase. It can be the difference between living and dying, especially if you play around thresholds. So for example, you don't even need to necessarily crit. You could get enemies down, you could damage a bunch of enemies. Let's say you have like 3 units with Vantage, and they're all kind of low HP, low enough to trigger Vantage, and you have them all hit 3 different enemies, and all of these enemies are at like half health. You can now enemy phase tank them, assuming that you have good hit rates and you can last hit them. So when they attack you, you can just chip them away, just kill them for that last hit. So it doesn't have to work off of crits. It can work off of other things as well. So there's definitely more to it than just crit builds. But it's a really good skill. There's a lot that you can do with it. There's a lot that hasn't been discovered with it, I'm sure. And it's like Canter. It's very generic and it works in a lot of use cases. So it's definitely something to point out. All right, and then finally we have Knife Precision. So this is a pretty good skill. It increases hit and avoid while using a knife. So you can get up to rank 2 before you do Leif's Paralog, and it's hit and avoid plus 5. Now, just getting an extra 5 avoid on a thief is pretty good because they get 60 avoid on avoid tiles. So getting plus 5 more, that adds up. And especially if you get Knife Precision 5, hit and avoid plus 15. This also allows the thief to accurately hit enemies to some degree on avoid tiles because you're reducing the void tiles effectiveness by half if they're not coverts. So any enemy that's on like your fog, if you're doing like a Corrin strat, now has 15 less avoid. Instead of plus 30, they'd just be like plus 15. So it's pretty useful. Most thieves don't have hit rate problems, so the hit is only really useful when you're attacking other things on avoid tiles or things that are exceptionally fast, like Wolf Knights, Sword Masters, enemy thieves, stuff like this, Griffin Knights. But mostly use this for the avoid, and it also helps thieves have higher base avoid off avoid tiles. So if you want to run a thief build or some kind of knife build, it could be a Wolf Knight build off of avoid tiles, where you're not specifically creating avoid tiles, you're just kind of death matching or just fighting out in the open. This can help patch up avoid, and you can combine this with something like Marth to just get, avoid plus 30 and then avoid plus 15. And then you combine that with an avoid engraving, and you're looking at huge avoid rates just from existing. So it's pretty useful. It's pretty good. It's situational though. There's definitely better options for thieves. I would rather have like holdout, for example, just in case like a mystic shows up, because sometimes they can ruin your fun and just like one round or almost one round your thieves because of the fact that, Zelkov has like bad res. Yunaka has better res, so she can kind of tank a little bit better, but that can be an issue. So having that passive avoid is nice. But those are Leif's abilities. Overall, there's a lot of utility here. Build is pretty useful. There's a lot of units that can take advantage of this. Arm Shield is situationally useful. You'd have to really play around it. Vantage is really good, and Knife Precision is situationally useful depending on what you're building. Overall, not too bad for utility, some decent passives. So that's it for this one. Definitely like and subscribe if you enjoyed this or found this useful. Feel free to drop a comment as to how you run any of these abilities and where you use them, and I'll see you in the next one.